The moment my son uttered those words, the air seemed to thicken, almost suffocating me. My wife, her mother, and the kids are moving in. No discussion. His tone was cold, absolute, as if my presence, my life, my authority didn't matter. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at him, absorbing the audacity, the sheer arrogance. Silence stretched between us, heavy and sharp, like a knife waiting to cut. He assumed I would argue, beg, or obey some predictable reaction that he could manipulate. But I didn't move, I didn't speak. I simply let the weight of his statement hang in the air. I had learned long ago that power isn't in shouting, isn't in demanding, and certainly isn't in trying to intimidate someone who has lived, suffered, and mastered patience and resilience. He left probably confident that he had successfully imposed his will, believing that within moments I would crumble, consent, and accept the invasion of my home. The thought of its strangers, no family-in-law, barging into my life, taking over my space, mocking my rules should have angered me immediately. But I didn't react in haste. I knew that true power comes from control, observation, and the ability to strike when the time is right. As the day wore on, I walked through my home slowly, touching familiar surfaces, feeling the rhythm of the life I had built. Each object, each corner, each subtle sound of the house reminded me of the patience I had cultivated. The walls had heard laughter, arguments, secrets, and tears. They had witnessed moments of triumph, heartbreak, and resilience. And now, the disrespect from my own son threatened to tarnish the sanctity of everything I had built. But I was not a woman who would react blindly. I was Adeline, and I knew the art of waiting, of observing, of planning. The evening approached, shadows lengthened across the driveway, and I sensed their arrival. My son's confidence would be tested soon. Their car pulled into the driveway, tires crunching softly on the gravel, the faint sound almost ominous, and then they stopped as if some invisible wall had materialized before them. What stood in front of them was not just a person. It was a force, a presence shaped by years of patience, strategy, and unyielding resolve. Adeline stepped forward, calm yet commanding, her eyes steady, her posture unshakable. The children shifted nervously in the backseat, sensing tension they could not name. Her son's wife, usually brimming with superiority, froze, and her mother's smug confidence faltered. The air was thick with disbelief. They had expected a frail, submissive figure. They had expected compliance. They had not expected Adeline. I didn't speak immediately. I let the silence do the work. Every second stretched, making the realization sink in. They could feel the weight of decades, the quiet strength that comes from enduring and mastering life's battles. Finally, I spoke softly, deliberately. "Welcome to my home. I hope you understand that nothing here belongs to anyone except me, and I do not negotiate what I have built." My words were calm, almost gentle, but they hit like a hammer. The arrogance, the entitlement, the assumptions of dominance evaporated in that single statement. My son's face paled, realizing for the first time that the power dynamics had shifted entirely. He had assumed control, yet control had always belonged to me. The woman he married tried to step forward, attempting to assert herself, but the confidence that usually radiated from her faltered. I raised a single hand, not threatening, merely signaling that any movement must be measured and deliberate. "Do not test me," I said quietly, each word deliberate, each pause calculated. "Respect is earned here, not demanded. Step carefully." The children, sensing tension, clung to her, their wide eyes scanning the imposing figure before them. My son's mother, usually smug and commanding, hesitated, realizing that her plans were crumbling under the weight of a presence she had not anticipated. Her eyes darted, her mind racing, trying to assess, to find some leverage, but there was none. I had prepared every possibility, every scenario, every silent battlefield before it had even begun. The evening stretched on as I allowed them to process the reality. They had assumed that moving in would be a simple act, a small conquest. They did not realize that in doing so, they had awakened a force that could not be shaken, threatened, or intimidated. My silence, my calm, my presence alone became a lesson, a demonstration that true authority is not loud, not aggressive, but unshakable and absolute. As I watched them hesitate by the driveway, the children unsure, the women frozen, and my son grasping for some semblance of control, I realized that tonight marked the beginning of a reckoning. I would not be hurried, I would not be rash, but I would ensure that every assumption, every arrogance, every disrespect was confronted, meticulously, strategically, and permanently. This was the moment when patience became power, when observation became dominance, when the quiet strength of a lifetime revealed itself fully. And from that day forward, the dynamics of this home would change irreversibly. My son had assumed authority in words, but he had not considered the reality of presence, strategy, and unwavering will. Tonight, they learned that Adeline was no ordinary woman. Adeline was a force patient, calculating, and absolutely relentless when it came to defending what was hers. Before any words could be spoken further, I stepped aside, motioning them to enter, my eyes never leaving theirs. "Every step you take here must be with respect," I said softly. "This is not a suggestion. It is the law of this house. You will learn it or you will leave. There is no middle ground." The car doors opened, tentative footsteps on the driveway, but each movement was careful, almost fearful. I could feel their uncertainty, their hesitation, and it satisfied a quiet part of me, the part that had endured betrayal, disrespect, and assumptions of weakness. They had assumed the battle would be theirs before it even began. They had underestimated me. As they moved closer, their eyes taking in every corner, every detail, every subtle message of preparedness and control I had arranged in my home, the tension grew. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply existed in the space I had claimed, radiating a calm authority that they could not ignore. And in that presence, in that silence, they learned the first of many lessons. Respect is not commanded. Respect is demonstrated. The evening unfolded slowly, deliberately. I guided them through the house, allowing them to perceive the order, the structure, the subtle signs that control had always been mine. Every glance, every gesture, every measured word communicated power without aggression. My son, realizing his miscalculation, hung back watching, understanding too late that he had assumed a position he was never granted. His wife and mother-in-law's confidence began to crumble, their assumptions and plans dissolving under the invisible weight of patience and strategy. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the driveway, I understood that this was only the beginning. They had seen the force, the presence, the unshakable will of Adeline, and it left them frozen. But the lessons, the consequences, the reckoning, all of it was yet to unfold. I had won the first move, the one that established dominance without confrontation, and the rest would follow in time, meticulously, strategically, and absolutely. Before the night fell completely, I walked to the window, observing the car, the family frozen in uncertainty, and whispered softly to myself, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. Every assumption has a cost. Every arrogance has a price, and tonight you are learning what it truly means to underestimate me. This was the first night of my retaliation. Every step forward would be deliberate, calculated, and unrelenting. And from this moment onward, the house, my life, and my authority would never be challenged again. I was Adeline, and they had learned the first lesson in my presence. Hesitation and fear are inevitable, and respect is not optional. The morning after their arrival, I woke with a quiet resolve, knowing today would test the boundaries I had begun to establish. I moved through my home slowly, deliberately, feeling the familiar rhythm of the rooms I had shaped with my own hands. Every corner, every object, every shadow reflected the life I had built, and no one would take that from me. My son had thought he could impose his will, but he hadn't accounted for my patience, my strategy, or my presence. Today, he would learn what it truly means to underestimate me. I started small, subtle adjustments that only I would notice, but that would unsettle anyone else. A chair slightly moved, a vase repositioned, the way the sunlight hit the floor, all deliberate. I didn't need to announce my authority. I let it ripple quietly through the house. Each time my son or his wife entered a room, I could see the tension flicker in their eyes. They were testing me, trying to gauge whether I would react, whether I would be intimidated. I smiled softly to myself. That was exactly what I had expected. When my son finally approached, trying to speak with a tone that he thought carried command, I simply looked at him. "Do you really believe you can take control here?" I asked softly, letting my calm voice fill the space. He faltered, trying to form a response, and I let him struggle. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't yell. I just existed fully in my space, a presence that was impossible to ignore. He realized too late that control in this house had never been his to claim. His wife attempted to assert herself next, trying to charm, to manipulate, to distract. I watched her carefully, meeting her words with steady eyes and measured responses. Each attempt she made only revealed her arrogance, her miscalculations, and I allowed her to see them for herself. There was no need for confrontation. The lesson was already unfolding in the tension, in the hesitation, in the way she couldn't maintain her usual confidence. I guided them through the house, letting them notice the details I had curated. The lighting, the order, the small touches in each room all communicated authority. Every corner reminded them, silently but unmistakably, that they were intruding on my life, my rules, my home. Even the children, sensing the tension and uncertainty, moved cautiously, instinctively aware that they were in someone else's domain, someone who would not be challenged. Throughout the day, I let minor incidents happen: a misplaced item, a delayed response, a question answered with careful ambiguity. Each one was deliberate, forcing them to question their assumptions, to recognize the fragility of their perceived dominance. I watched closely as my son tried to regain composure, as his wife's arrogance wavered, and as his mother's usual confidence faltered under the invisible weight of my presence. Every subtle misstep they made reinforced the lesson. Respect is earned here, not demanded, and arrogance has a cost. By evening, the household had shifted subtly but completely. My son no longer spoke with certainty. His words were cautious, weighed, calculated. His wife hesitated before making any move, unsure of how to assert herself, realizing that her usual tactics were useless. Even his mother, who had always commanded attention, found herself tentative. Her presence diminished under my calm but unshakable authority. The children watched quietly, absorbing the dynamics without needing to be taught. I walked through the rooms one more time before nightfall, allowing myself a quiet satisfaction. I had begun to reclaim my home not through anger or confrontation, but through observation, patience, and subtle dominance. They had felt the shift. They had seen, without a single raised voice, that I was the one in control. And I knew that this was just the beginning, the first wave of lessons in a plan that would ensure they never underestimated me again. As I stood by the window, watching them settle into the guest area, I whispered to myself, a soft smile on my lips, "This house is mine, my rules, my control, and they will learn in time that every assumption comes at a price." I felt the weight of victory in the silence of my home, the quiet acknowledgement that my patience, my strategy, and my presence had already begun to dismantle the arrogance that had invaded my life. Tonight was only the start, and I would ensure that every next step they took would reinforce the truth they could no longer deny. I am Adeline, and no one challenges me in my home. The morning arrived with a heavy quiet, the sunlight creeping through the windows as if it too knew the tension that had settled in my home. I moved through each room deliberately, letting my presence fill the spaces, each step a reminder that this was my domain. My son had been cautious since yesterday, but I knew that caution alone would not teach the full lesson. Today, I would escalate not with anger or aggression, but with calculated moves that would leave no doubt about who controlled this house. I started with small tasks, giving instructions to the household, observing every reaction carefully. My son's wife tried to interject, offering suggestions with a smile meant to charm, but I met her gaze steadily, my calm voice cutting through her assumptions. "You will follow the rules of this home, or you will leave. There is no negotiation." I watched as her eyes flickered with surprise, then hesitation. She had assumed she could manipulate or influence, but she quickly realized she was in unfamiliar territory. Every word, every glance, every subtle pause I allowed became a lesson in obedience. The children were watching too, quiet but perceptive. I made sure they understood boundaries without saying too much, letting them sense the order, the hierarchy, and the weight of my presence. Even the youngest began to move cautiously, testing the edges of behavior but stopping short, aware of the silent authority I carried. It pleased me in a way I hadn't expected, to see them adjusting instinctively the ripple effect of control through quiet dominance. When my son approached me later in the morning, trying to sound assertive, I let him speak, listening carefully to the tone in his voice, the hesitation between words. "Mom, I think maybe we could." He trailed off, uncertainty creeping in. I didn't interrupt. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it pressing down. Finally, I spoke softly, deliberately, my voice calm but absolute. "You think you have control, but control has never been yours to claim. Every move, every word, every assumption you've made has been observed. Today, you are learning that authority is not given. It is recognized or it is challenged." His wife attempted to redirect the tension, smiling politely and trying to charm me into leniency. I didn't rise to it. I let her attempt fail silently, watching as frustration crept in. Every small tactic she employed only served to expose the miscalculations she had made. I allowed them to see themselves clearly, to feel the weight of the lesson without my needing to raise my voice or show anger. By midday, I began orchestrating subtle tests, moments designed to measure their reactions. I rearranged furniture slightly, moved objects just enough to unsettle, delayed responses to requests, and allowed minor mistakes to occur, observing how they would correct themselves. Each test revealed cracks in their confidence, hesitation in their actions, and a growing realization that the house, the rules, and the authority belonged to me. I did not need to threaten them. The presence I carried did the work itself. My son began to falter more noticeably as the day wore on. Every attempt at asserting himself was met with calm, calculated redirection. I watched him weigh his words carefully, attempt reasoning, then hesitate, realizing that each effort to dominate was futile. His arrogance, once so confident, began to waver, replaced with tentative observation. He was beginning to see, as I had hoped, that underestimating me was the gravest mistake he could have made. By late afternoon, my son's wife and mother-in-law were both visibly unnerved. The woman who had assumed she could manipulate and charm now hesitated at every step, uncertain of how to act or speak. The subtle authority I exerted in silence made them aware of their own missteps, their own arrogance, and the consequences they had not anticipated. Even the children, sensing the tension and hierarchy, moved carefully, learning without being explicitly told that rules and boundaries were absolute. I allowed the evening to unfold slowly, deliberately. Every interaction reinforced the lessons I wanted them to absorb. A question asked incorrectly received a calm correction. A careless step was guided subtly. Minor attempts at influence were neutralized by my presence alone. Each subtle act reminded them that they were no longer in a position to assume authority, and every hesitation they showed deepened the understanding of their place in my household. As night fell, I observed the family from the hallway, watching their careful movements, measured words, and the quiet deference that had begun to replace arrogance. My son no longer assumed his usual confidence. His wife's attempts at charm had faded into tentative compliance, and his mother's presence was restrained by the invisible force of authority I wielded without raising my voice. Even the children seemed to understand instinctively that they were now in a home governed by someone who would not tolerate disrespect or assumption. I moved through the house, touching familiar surfaces, feeling the weight of control I had reclaimed. The day had been long, but it had succeeded beyond my expectations. I had not yelled, not threatened, not created chaos. I had asserted my presence, demonstrated my authority, and orchestrated every moment with deliberate precision. The lessons had begun to take root, and the ripples would continue to shape their understanding and behavior for days to come. As I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet night, I whispered softly to myself, "Every step, every word, every assumption is measured against me, and every miscalculation comes with a cost. They are learning, slowly, that I am not to be underestimated." The satisfaction was quiet, deep, and absolute. The first waves of consequence had been delivered, and I knew the next phase would drive the lessons even further, leaving no room for doubt or defiance. I smiled, a faint, controlled curve of my lips. The night was still, the house calm, but within it, the balance of power had shifted entirely. I had reclaimed what was mine, and they had begun to understand, fully and irrevocably, that challenging me, questioning me, or assuming control would be their undoing. I am Adeline, and no one will ever forget it. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt before. The air in the house was thick with anticipation, though none of them realized it yet. My son, his wife, and her mother had begun to understand that yesterday had been only the beginning, the first demonstration of what happens when someone challenges me in my own home. But clarity alone would not be enough. They needed to feel it, to internalize it, to recognize the consequences of their arrogance. Today, I would make them see it in ways they could neither ignore nor forget. I moved through the rooms with a deliberate calm, touching familiar surfaces, feeling the rhythm of the space I had created. Every object, every shadow, every faint sound of the house carried my presence. I didn't speak unnecessarily. I didn't need to. My existence alone was enough to unsettle, to command, to remind them that authority was not optional, and disrespect came at a cost. By mid-morning, I began orchestrating subtle psychological tests. A misplaced personal item left deliberately where it would be noticed. A soft click of a door left slightly ajar, drawing attention at precisely the right moment. Small things seemingly insignificant, but each carefully calculated to make them doubt, to make them question, to make them recognize the boundaries they had ignored. I watched as my son, who had always prided himself on foresight, hesitated before entering rooms, scanning for the unseen measures I had set. His wife's smile faltered when she noticed changes she had not anticipated, and her mother's confident demeanor cracked ever so slightly with each subtle challenge I laid before them. By noon, the tension had grown so thick that it was almost tangible. Every interaction, every movement, every whispered exchange among them became a lesson in observation and restraint. I allowed them to make mistakes, knowing that each misstep would teach more effectively than any lecture. My son accidentally knocked a small item off the counter, and I caught it silently, handing it back without a word. The weight in my gaze alone made him flinch, and I could see him absorb the lesson. Every action is measured here, and nothing goes unnoticed. I let the afternoon stretch slowly, deliberately. I engaged with them calmly, answering questions, observing behavior, redirecting attempts at manipulation with subtle precision. I allowed small challenges to present themselves, then neutralized them without raising my voice. Every correction, every adjustment, every silent assertion of authority reinforced my dominance. They were learning that control was not won with words or charm, but with presence, intelligence, and patience. By late afternoon, the cracks were widening. My son moved cautiously, no longer confident in his assertions. His words weighed carefully before leaving his lips. His wife hesitated in her every action, realizing that charm and manipulation had no power here. The mother-in-law, whose usual arrogance had dominated every room, was subdued, forced to consider her place and her behavior. Even the children, who had been innocently unaware, sensed the weight of authority and adjusted instinctively, understanding that the household operated on rules set by someone unyielding and unshakable. I allowed a brief silence to settle as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the rooms. The quiet was heavy, loaded with unspoken lessons. I knew that the full force of my strategy was working. They were beginning to internalize the truth I had long held, that underestimating me was the gravest mistake they could make. I didn't need to yell, threaten, or manipulate. The consequences were evident in their movements, their hesitation, their faltering confidence. As evening approached, I introduced a more tangible assertion of control. I arranged a simple task for them, observing closely as they moved to complete it. Each step was measured, and each misstep revealed their overconfidence and assumptions. When they faltered, I allowed them to struggle just enough before intervening, demonstrating calmly but unmistakably that their authority did not exist here. The realization hit them slowly but with growing intensity. Every action in this house was monitored, every decision noted, every assumption challenged. By nightfall, the psychological impact was undeniable. My son had begun to speak only when necessary, weighing each word and action. His wife and mother-in-law were subdued, their usual confidence replaced by careful observation and quiet restraint. Even the children, though young, moved cautiously, aware of boundaries they had never known before. The house had shifted entirely. The balance of power now rested fully with me, and they understood fully the consequences of their arrogance. As I stood by the window, watching them adjust to the order I had established, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This was more than just reclaiming my home. It was asserting the authority, patience, and intelligence that had been overlooked for too long. Every subtle adjustment, every careful observation, every silent correction had led to this moment. The complete acknowledgement of my power, the full recognition of my control, and the internalization of the lessons I had been delivering for days. I whispered softly to myself, a faint, confident smile on my lips. They will never challenge me again. They will never assume control where it does not exist. They will remember always that I am Adeline and this is my home. The night was quiet, the house calm, but within it, the lessons had taken root, irreversible and absolute. The foundation of obedience, respect, and recognition of authority had been set, and every subsequent action they would take would reinforce the truth. Underestimating me comes with consequences that cannot be ignored, evaded, or reversed. Tonight, I had delivered the final wave of this phase of retaliation. They had seen the depth of my control, the precision of my strategy, and the quiet power that cannot be challenged. The lessons had been harsh yet measured, humiliating yet instructive, and absolute in their effectiveness. From this point forward, every action, every word, every assumption in this house would be met with the reality of my authority, and they would learn, in time and without question, that no one defies Adeline in her own home. The morning air was heavy with anticipation, though they did not yet realize it. I woke with a quiet resolve, knowing today would bring the final reckoning. My son, his wife, and her mother had begun to grasp the truth that my patience was not weakness, that my silence was not submission, and that every assumption they had made about control in this house was wrong. But understanding alone would not suffice. They needed to feel the weight of the lessons fully, to see clearly that I am not a woman to be underestimated. I moved through the house with purpose, each step deliberate, each gesture calculated. Every object I touched, every corner I passed, carried a subtle message. This is my domain, my rules, my authority. They watched me, and I let them, allowing the tension to build naturally. Their caution was gratifying, but it was not enough. They needed to experience the consequences directly, to realize that arrogance and entitlement would not be tolerated here. I began with small but undeniable challenges. I assigned simple tasks, observing every movement, every hesitation, every faltering attempt at control. My son tried to assert himself verbally, attempting to negotiate, to argue, to manipulate. I listened, letting each word expose his misplaced confidence. "You speak as if you hold power here," I said calmly, locking eyes with him. "But authority is not given. It is earned or recognized, and you have done neither." The realization dawned on him slowly, painfully, as he grasped that everything he assumed about this house was wrong. His wife tried to intervene, attempting charm, trying to soften the tension, but I met her gaze evenly, unwavering. Every smile she offered fell flat against the quiet strength I projected. I let her flounder for a moment before responding in a calm, precise tone that left no room for misinterpretation. "This house is mine. Every step you take here must acknowledge that. Every word must respect it." The clarity in my voice stripped away any pretense she thought she could maintain, revealing the fragility of their perceived control. By midday, the subtle shifts I had orchestrated escalated naturally. I moved objects deliberately, changed the order of routines, introduced minor, controlled obstacles, and observed how they reacted. Every hesitation, every misstep reinforced my dominance. They realized that no effort at manipulation or negotiation could bypass the authority I had established. Every movement they made, every assumption they held, was subject to my observation, and they could not escape the weight of it. The children, quiet observers of all these interactions, began to internalize the rules without needing explicit instruction. Their movements became cautious, measured, aware of boundaries they had not understood before. I watched them, proud of the subtle lesson they were learning. Respect and recognition of authority are not threats. They are truths that must be acknowledged. Even the youngest could feel the tension, the quiet command in the air, the inevitability of consequence. As the afternoon wore on, I increased the stakes. I allowed them to attempt minor challenges, then neutralized them with calm precision. I let small mistakes happen, creating moments where their arrogance collided with reality, forcing them to confront the consequences of their assumptions. My son's confidence wavered further, his wife's attempts at influence faltered, and the mother-in-law's composure cracked ever so slightly. Each observation, each silent correction, drove the lesson deeper. In this house, control belongs to me, and defiance comes at a cost. By evening, the transformation was complete. Their tentative compliance, the hesitation in their movements, the careful weighing of words, all confirmed that they had internalized the truth. They had entered my home as intruders, with assumptions and entitlement, and they were leaving the arrogance behind. I did not need to yell, to threaten, or to create chaos. My presence, my strategy, and my patience had accomplished everything. Every subtle action had delivered the message, and the consequences were now undeniable. I moved through the rooms one last time, letting my gaze sweep over the house I had reclaimed, the family now fully aware of the hierarchy. I allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of it settle. My son looked at me, a mixture of awe and fear in his eyes. His wife avoided my gaze, her usual confidence replaced by cautious respect. The mother-in-law remained silent, restrained by the invisible authority that radiated from me. The children, watching, understood instinctively the rules of this house, rules set by someone they could neither ignore nor challenge. Finally, I spoke, softly but firmly, letting my voice carry the authority of every action, every lesson, every subtle correction I had orchestrated. "You will remember this day. Every assumption you had, every thought of control, every attempt to manipulate it ends here. This house is mine. My rules, my authority, my presence. Learn it, accept it, and you will be safe. Challenge it, and you will face the consequences you have already seen." The impact of my words hung in the air, a final reinforcement of everything they had felt over the past days. They understood fully now there was no ambiguity, no negotiation, no pretense. I had delivered the ultimate lesson. Respect, obedience, and recognition of authority are non-negotiable. Their arrogance had been dismantled, their assumptions shattered, and the house, my life, my domain, fully reclaimed. As night fell and they retreated to the guest area, I allowed myself a quiet, victorious breath. This was the culmination of my strategy, my patience, and my relentless observation. Every subtle act, every calculated intervention, every moment of silence had led to this. The complete acknowledgement of my power, the irreversible transformation of their perception, and the final, absolute victory in reclaiming my home. Standing by the window, I whispered to myself, a smile touching my lips, "They will never underestimate me again. They will never assume control where it does not exist. This house, my life, my rules, all are mine, and every day they spend here will remind them of it." The night was still, but within it, the lessons had taken root deep and permanent. My retaliation was complete, and the consequences would linger forever. I am Adeline, and this is my home. My authority is absolute. My patience is infinite, and anyone who dares challenge me will learn, inevitably, that underestimating me is a mistake they can never afford to repeat.